Is college a scam? In a world where higher education often seems more focused on passing on a particular ideology than pursuing truth, what role do Christian colleges play? Are they the last bastion of hope in higher education for young believers navigating a culture that's increasingly hostile to their faith? Well, today I'm joined by Dr. Joseph R. Miller, a scholar who's not only asking these questions, but also shaping the answers. Dr. Miller is the assistant professor of Christian Worldview and the Worldview Lead at Grand Canyon University. He co-founded the Center for Cultural Apologetics and is a fellow with Reasons to Believe. Dr. Miller is also an author, blogger, and podcaster with a passion for equipping Christians to think critically and live faithfully. And he is also a friend. And so I am done calling him Dr. Joe. What's going on, man? How you doing?
Man, doing great. It's good to see you, my friend. It's been a while since we've chatted, and I've been watching what you're doing. You're doing good stuff, man. So keep it up.
Well, keep buttering me up for a little bit more, and because hey,
all the time,
it is good.
Man.
It is good to see you. For those that don't know you, when someone asks me, so tell me about Joe, I would say, well, I think he knows everything about everything. So, and I don't say that, about very many people, but you just have a wide range of knowledge. And you're also one who, at least in my estimation, that knowledge hasn't puffed you up, but you use that knowledge and humility to love and serve other people. So I'm really, really grateful for this conversation. Now, we're not going to talk about everything, we're going to talk about something a little bit more specific. We're going to talk about higher education, and just starting with this question, is college a scam? What do you think? Charlie Kirk, for example, Turning Point USA, he's out there and he does all of those, it's not man on the streets, like man on the university, if you will. He's got a tent, people come up and he's going there. And I think he wrote a book too, Is College a Scam? Well, he's there talking about this, and you have students, right, that are spending $200,000, give or take. He's telling them this is a scam. They're obviously going to be bothered by this. What's your take on this? What do you think of Kirk and what he's doing, or just the broader question of whether or not college is a scam?
Yeah, so I've heard him talk about that. I've seen some of his episodes. The Man in the University might be a good word for it. The change my mind type of things that he does. And yeah, Kirk is he's a bomb thrower. He likes to. He's figured out the social media thing. You say the controversial, to say the radical thing. And I know I'm not saying he's not convinced of what he believes, but if you read a little bit of what he writes, he qualifies that. He means something very specific like that. So, and I think one of the dangers that he talks about is that, one of his big concerns is college that indoctrinates students rather than teaching them how to think. The irony is that the claim college is a scam is a little bit more like the indoctrination he criticizes than really a thoughtful response to what are the issues facing higher education. So can it be a scam, and can it be really bad for certain people? Absolutely. So I remember back when I was a youth pastor many years ago, and a mom came up to me and said, "Hey, you've been to school, and my son, little Timmy, doesn't want to go to college. Can you convince him to go?" I said, I don't think you want to have a conversation with him. And she's like, "Oh no, he does." I was like, "Well, no, because Timmy really shouldn't be in college. I know him and I've seen him, and it's not for him." And it wasn't a criticism of him or his intellect or whatever. But what she didn't understand is he was just more driven towards working with his hands, vocational type of things. And so the idea, if we think college, everyone must go to college to be successful or to be valuable, or if you don't do college, you're not smart, then yeah, that's a scam. Like if that's what we mean by it, that's a scam. If we look at the useless degrees, which Kirk talks about a lot, right? That's very true. Basket weaving, feminist, lesbian studies on Mars, whatever. We just get into these granular sort of things that are ridiculous, especially at the higher you go, master's, doctoral level, but even in the undergrad level, you can get a lot of useless degrees. And I think Christians need to be aware about this one too. Even theology degrees, we have to be very careful. So what I usually encourage young people to do is either one of two things: major in something that'll get you a job, like engineering or business or something, whatever, technology, that sort of thing. And then minor in theology or philosophy. Or you can flip it too. If you really want to do your major in theology or philosophy, then minor in something that'll give you a skill set that'll make you hireable. And so that's really important as well. Go ahead, jump in.
Well, no, I think that's, there has to be a nuance is like the word of the year, right? Yeah. Love and hate the word nuance. It's obviously appropriate. And a lot of times it's a way for people just to say, hey, don't look at what I'm really saying. It's nuance. There's detail. And no, it's clear what you're saying, bud. Anyhow, but when it comes to this and even Kirk's position, right, this is what, you start unpacking with this notion of, is it a scam? You consider like a value proposition of, should you spend $250,000 to get some of these kinds of degrees? Well, heck no. Well, what's the full range of that even for some young men and women who spend $250,000, maybe walk away with a psychology degree without understanding the full path to becoming a psychologist or even understanding if that's what they want. It was just something they were kind of interested in. And now you're $250,000 either invested or in debt for a degree that is what? What are you going to do? What are you going to go on to it? And I don't have these statistics right in front of me. This is how prepared I am often, Joe. But
no.
Kirk, he puts out things like the number of people who get jobs in fields that aren't in alignment with their degree. There's probably a number of people listening right now and like, yeah, I just have that piece of paper and the work that I do has nothing to do with it. And so from that side, if an institution is promising you the ability to, learn, expand your knowledge and become trained such that you can then go get a job, well, so that's a little bit where Kirk is coming from. Yeah. There's some kind of scam
For
that
sure.
you're preying on people.
There is absolutely that piece of it. Yeah.
And then you take the ideology, and that some of these institutions become indoctrination centers. Maybe that's not so much of a scam as it's just, I don't know what Kirk might say. And why are we spending so much time talking about Kirk here, Joe?
Yeah, I don't know. It's not a scam in that sense, but it is misleading because you think you're going to school to learn about how to run a business or just to be a teacher. I love kindergartners and I want to just help them. I want to be a nurse. But what you end up getting is indoctrinated into a worldview like critical race theory or just critical social studies, to be more broadly specific about like the general theme of critical studies. So yeah, you end up being indoctrinated into a worldview when all you thought you were going to do is learn how to calculate stresses on a beam as an engineer, right? But you end up with something you didn't. And then you pay for the fact that they've screwed up your whole way of seeing the world. And that part of it, I do think, is a scam in that they're giving you one thing. It's like a shell game. They give you one thing, they give you something else. So I do think that's a problem. And I think the money side is really important too, because all these college rankings, those are definitely a scam. The U.S. World Reports and the top colleges, none of that has anything to do with the quality of education. For many people, you can get a very good education, an AA at a community college for many things that will equip you to have a job or be successful in life. Matter of fact, I encourage a lot of students, like even if you want to go to a particular place like Grand Canyon University or whatever, right? You can still do a couple years of community college in places like California that's free and incur no debt, then transfer in your credits to a 4-year college and finish if that's really something that you want. So there are a lot of strategies to do that, Mike. And I think people do buy into the expectation that I have to do it this certain way, but they don't think about the other side. And last point I'll make on that is, you can do it without going into inordinate debt and screwing up your whole life, right? So, for example, I did my undergrad engineering at Penn State. Since then, I have 3 masters and 2 doctorates, right? I'm overeducated. I just like to learn, right? That's why I know a lot of stuff about everything.
That's why you know all the things.
Yeah, but I have zero debt. I didn't go into debt for any of it, and I paid for everything as I went along the way. Now, I also had to make choices. So you'll notice if people see my CV or my resume, Harvard isn't listed there. The university I really wanted to go to was University of Edinburgh for my PhD, but I would have to move there and live there and pay $80,000. And then you'd have to not be able to work, and then I'd have to take loans to support my life, and I had a wife and 3 kids. So I go to places that weren't on my top list necessarily, but I found a way to do it. So my entire PhD I did for like 17.5, as opposed to 75,000. But I can make that work. I had to consider, am I going to get a pay bump off of this degree or not? And if you're not, it may not be worth doing it, or do it over years, do it in night school, find other ways. So the scam is that you have to do it this very certain way and pay a top dollar. And I think that's what we can avoid those sort of mistakes.
So, yeah, I grew up and it was certainly the vision, like you have to go to college and this kind of college and take the debt, take the money because it's low interest and you're going to get a pay. And that was like, there was one path pushed, go do it. I think that's going away. And I think that's helpful. And I do think to a degree, Kirk and folks like him are helping that raise awareness to the challenges of higher ed and to think more critically about how one should partake of it, whether they should go, if so, for what reason, and should they go here or they should go there? Should they start this? Should they, all of these kind of important questions rather than just which one has the best college football team and can I get into it kind of thing. So, without getting into maybe spending too much time or even any time really on why the universities have become like they are, maybe a more insightful question or thing for us to talk about is what should a college be? Because let's just assume that, even if it is a scam, we say that because we have some sense of what it should be. What, in your mind, what is the university? What is the purpose and the point of college? And in a perfect world, a university would look like what? It would be like what? What do you think about that?
So years ago, I looked, and there was an interesting study that was done on who gets hired for what jobs, right? And one of the most interesting thing was a lot of the Silicon Valley, computer, high-tech companies, right? Who do they hire? Who do they want? Generally, they didn't hire back in the day people that graduated with a computer science degree, which seems to make no sense. You're in computing, you're programming. But what they realized is that they needed somebody who had an education to be able to think critically about life, to think creatively. And what they found is a lot of times the people that go through these certain degree paths with a computer science degree didn't know how to think outside of the textbook, out of the box, so to speak. They didn't have critical thinking skills. So what they do is they'd hire liberal arts majors who took philosophy or other things that taught them how to think about life. And they're like, hey, we're going to hire you because that has taught you how to think. And then we'll give you the skills you need. Now apply that to this programming technique and how to write this code or do whatever. Because we can teach the skills, they said, but what we can't teach is how to think about life. And so what college should be is what it used to be in this Aristotelian model that we adopted and had worked for centuries. And now it's we've shifted into an indoctrination model. It was a model of critical thinking and how to think about stuff. And that's one of the reasons why I do recommend, even now you can get away with it, take a minor in philosophy, regardless of what your major is, because you'll learn how to think critically about stuff. And if you can do that, you'll be far more employable, you'll be far more valuable in any field that you go into. So
would you say that the notion of university is kind of like out of the diverse disciplines, one sees the unity therein and can kind of comprehend this unity in the sense of what is the nature of even ultimate reality, that it's to be a time where you develop or refine perhaps the skills of critical thinking in an interdisciplinary environment such that you get a pretty full and comprehensive grasp on the nature of reality, such that then, okay, yeah, like Google or whatever says, great, you have that. Let's just teach you the tech skills you need, or Microsoft or whatever. That's a pretty interesting take on university. When should that start? And to some degree, because does that need to begin in high school? And what's this kind of relationship in the United States anyways of lower ed and higher ed? Because in part of my experience, it seems like there's such redundancy in the two, and maybe even just going back to how bad things are, the same redundancy of not being taught any of it, just being indoctrinated all across the board. So I don't know, what's the relationship there between even lower ed and higher ed, and as it contributes to having one get a full understanding of the nature of reality and how to orient themselves therein?
Yeah. Well, this gets a little bit to, I think we want to go a little bit on advice for parents and talk a little bit about that as well. But one of those things that parents can look at is, what is the curriculum that my kid is being taught? And there is a resurgence, there is a revival amongst many parents and communities for what's called classical education. And so classical education is looking at a more broad spectrum of disciplines and studies. I have actually a set of books that I got before I had kids. I'm like, how am I going to educate my kid? What am I going to do? And it was this set from like the 1800s. It was just all of these things, learning how to, teaching kids rhetoric, how to speak. And they had poetry sections and they had math. It was just a whole spectrum of things that they learned. And they were learning this before there was no high school, there was no this thing. You go back in the day, the actual, this is going to be surprise you maybe, the level of literacy in the early 1900s is actually higher than our literacy level today. We have people that are functionally literate but practically illiterate, in terms of they can't process complex ideas. So you go back when people were getting a sixth grade education, you think, oh, those people were dumb back then. But the truth is, that sixth grade education a lot of times taught them how to think more critically about life and to process things than we do now. So classical education, if people want to search that up, find out if there's a place that's doing that. That's a model that I think is really good for the K through 12 levels before you even get to the college level.
Hey, maybe this is too much of a side note, but what's the hope maybe for literacy? Because you think about, and there's a more precise term than what I'm able to recall now, but a text-based culture versus a digital-based culture, which we're certainly in the latter now. You know, the smartphones, we consume content through, like, it's a visual. Well, of course, text is also visual, but images, film, memes. We're really not that text-based culture like in the 1900s. So is there a sense where it's like this literacy proficiency is doomed to remain where it is? Is that too bleak of an outlook that I'm proposing?
Yeah, well, I think as in everything, you look at historically, there's always a pendulum swing, right? We go one way too far and then we have to correct, and to correct, you go back way too far the other way. So the problem historically, I think, in the West, in our Enlightenment sort of thinking, is that we became too text focused, too book oriented, which you may think sounds surprising given my background. But I think we became so fixated as if that's the only way to learn. And so when you look at our video culture, I actually think the video visual culture is more of a storytelling culture. You think about Jesus teaching in parables. The Old Testament was an oral tradition before it was a written tradition, yet people could learn. So there's a learning that comes with a visual culture that is a key part of how our brains work, how we memorize stuff, how we process information and think holistically about life. So I think there's a potential educational value and beauty in the video-driven culture, as long as we don't swing that pendulum so far that we abandon the written form of communication. So learning how to process an argument is very different. You can watch it in a visual, and you can engage the emotions and the intellect and all these things. But then when you read it, sometimes you process it differently so that you can, wait a second, let me turn back 3 pages in this book and say, that doesn't make sense with this. Something you can get away with on the visual, but you can't get away with in the written. So I think it's a both and solution, and educationally doing a lot of videos. I think hopefully you've seen some of my video stuff I do with my Worldview stuff. I've got about 21 videos out right now, all 2 to 5 minutes, but I take these key concepts and I give them to my students, say, this is the review of the lecture you had. This is a review of the written text that you've been working on. So you need all of those components working together for a holistic education. So I don't think it'll be the end, but I do think we're going to go through an unfortunate pendulum swing where we go a little bit too far and devalue the written, but hopefully we'll learn the value of the visual and then go back to the need for both the visual and the written.
That's really good. That's gold, man. That's good stuff there, Joe. So related to that, what about AI? I know you've done some work on that. It's impossible to talk about education in college without talking about AI. I'm using it like crazy. I don't think it's using me yet. But is this another one of how are we to think about AI? I guess even broadly speaking, but when it comes to education, how are we to think about it? And if there's a way to avoid some kind of pendulum swing or overcorrecting, problem here, what's your view on AI, its good, its bad, and its proper place in education?
Yeah. So there's a lot, obviously, we won't get into in this. People need to understand AI can be dehumanizing. It misunderstands the nature of human personhood and identity and consciousness. That's a sort of a philosophical, and there's a theological component to that too, where it can be very destructive potentially. But I'll just stick to your question here in our theme of education on that. I just want to throw that out so people are aware that is something that needs to be explored, and we need to be careful to look at before we just assume what's the application, right? We're a very culture about application. So there's a couple challenges with AI, and those deal with how humans do learn, right? There's a hierarchy of learning levels. The most basic level is, say, memorization. I learn some things, right? And then I can go up through levels of learning to the most complex, which are synthesis. Take one idea. Mike Sherrard teaches, this is his ecclesiology. Compare Mike Sherrard's ecclesiology to, Augustine's ecclesiology. Well, that's going to require me to not just know information, but then pull that information together and synthesize and then make an analysis and then summarize. And there's a lot of complex skills that are involved. AI is terrible at it. It can't do it. It does a horrible job of it. It gives the illusion of it, but it doesn't do it well.
Because AI, the AI that we use right now it's a language model, right? It's analyzing the statistical relationship of letters to other letters, words to words. So it's not built to do that complex reasoning yet. It's simply analyzing language. Am I right, or am I behind the times even now with where AI is?
No, it's close enough, but you can find, I see it on Facebook. I got an advertisement a month ago on, hey, let us write your paper. And I go and I tested it out and I said, okay, compare these two things and write me a paper. It wrote me a 5-page paper in less than a minute. And I read through and it sounded pretty good. It did a decent job, except that I knew a lot of the information was wrong. But it sounded like a great comparison and analysis. And so there's a ceiling that we're going to hit with these large language models that I don't believe it'll ever be able to truly synthesize unless you train it on somebody else who's already synthesized those things. But then it's not really synthesizing. It's giving the illusion of synthesis because it doesn't think and process information that way. And so it's the illusion of that. So the real challenge for education is that if we introduce the tool too quickly, we will short circuit the learning process of development for humans because we think AI is helping us when it's not. I'll give you a quick story. This might be helpful to understand what I'm saying here. So when I was in my undergrad in engineering, I had my first class in steel structure analysis and design. So we're building steel members in a building, right, out of steel structures. And my professor, Abassam and Mansour, was very clear, we could use calculators for our tests because we're doing these, complex problems, but don't program the calculator with formulas. If you do that, you won't do well. You have to learn how to derive the formulas to answer the problems. So my friends and I are like, oh, well, he's just behind the times. He doesn't understand technology, where it's at. We had these very smart calculators back then. You can program it in, these complex equations, and then you enter 10 numbers in the stack of the calculator. You hit enter, and they'll put all those numbers into that formula. They'll pop out the number. Well, I failed my class. I failed that class. and because it didn't work that way. So I had to take that class again. And the next time I got the class, I think I got an A or B. I can't remember, but I disciplined myself. I can't use I can use it to run the numbers. I can do it 4+4 because, believe it or not, that the basic math is actually all it's good for. No matter how fancy the calculator is, the only thing it's good for is the basic math. The smartest kid in our degree program, which was one of the top programs in the country, man, it was really tough. He was a brilliant kid. He had those little solar powered calculators with had just the numbers on it and a couple little things, and he was get A+ on everything. He never missed a thing, right? Because what I had to learn was that when I'm confronted with a problem, I can't just find a formula that solves the problem. I actually have to derive the formula through a process of reasoning and thinking. It's what happens in philosophy. It's what happens in theology. But it's what you have to do to be a successful engineer. That's why I argue engineers are some of the best theologians, because they know how to derive and think through complex things. They're just as good at it as philosophers. They're just usually not as winsome and lovely, and the rhetoric isn't as good. But they know how to think that way. And so that's the problem with AI. It's going to subvert our ability to think and derive critical functional equations for doing life, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's going to, if we use it in a way that subverts that, we're going to be in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, well, I've seen that potential threat, and because I see what it's good at and what it's good for. And in many ways, it's like a personal assistant. But I also see how it can atrophy certain skills that I currently have. And then knowing what is the offset between an atrophy in this skill set that technology can support. What does that then allow me to focus on and do others? It's hard to know that, right? And that's the challenge with technology, is we have it before we know how we should use it often. When we're presented now with the tools of AI, we have instructions on literally how to use it. Like, here's how you do your prompts. But how should we use it? Which is a moral question. It's an ethical question. Yeah. That always comes after the fact. And it's really challenging because you start developing practices prior to the ethics. And then it's almost like, whatever the metaphor, the cat's out of the bag at that point. It's like, it's really hard to walk this back. And that's almost, without even like pointing a finger at, we're all the ethicists. In many ways, that's just going to be the nature of technology, because it's on you. It just comes upon you. And then you have to figure out, what are the ethics here? Now, it's not that bleak. There can be ethical, even in thought experiments, we need to be thinking ethically about what if this were, and if this were to come in, we do need to get ahead of it, and we can, even though much of this situation is going to be reactionary. Anyways, that being the case, are you providing your students any kind of like ethical guardrails? Like, here's how to properly use it. Here's how you should use it. Is GCU taking kind of like you should not ever use it? And if so, how are you guys policing that and finding that out? Long and the short of my question is, have you found kind of an ethical guideline, blueprint, instruction book from an ethics standpoint to guide your students in how they use AI?
So, as a university, Grand Canyon University, they're definitely working with this and struggling with it like everybody else. And I just should throw out the disclaimer. I don't speak officially for them at this point. I'm not a official representative, anything like that. I'm just speaking as a faculty member here, that with my perceptions of things. So I get
excited about those. Right? I get excited about disclaimers because I'm assuming what comes next is controversial. So go ahead.
No, I don't think it's controversial. I just feel like I have to say that. But so I think Grand Canyon is trying to be cutting edge and innovative. We've developed internally our own AI tools for different programs. I won't say which ones. I think they're all public, but I won't say. But and I think the way that they've developed some of these tools can be fairly helpful and useful. I know some faculty in their courses that are doing some creative assignments utilizing AI and how they think about it. And so I think that there's some valuable lessons we can learn and ways to integrate that. But for me, and where I'm at, because I teach primarily freshmen, I teach Christian Worldview 101, and I get mostly freshmen coming in. In my class, my answer is don't use it at all, because they don't have the tools and the skill set to learn it properly. And I don't have it's not the class context where I can teach them how to use it properly. So I try to tell them why not. And I try to explain a little bit about the skills I want them to develop so they'll be successful, not just academically, but in life and in careers as parents and family. I try to educate them on it's going to seem hard because don't use this, and everybody's using it. And some other faculty say, you go ahead and use it. So I try to share my rationale, but I don't allow them because I don't think they have the basic fundamental skills necessary. Higher division courses, I think it's much better tool potentially, depending on the course and how it's how it's going to work together. It's much more useful in some types of courses. But like my calculator example for my engineering, I think a lot of it will debilitate our reasoning, and it's going to make us worse at our jobs than better at our jobs. Especially if we try to use it too early in our process of development.
Yeah. So I'm with you. It's hard for me to imagine. I just can't even imagine how this is going to be policed, because I see that the use of AI in higher ed works against why you're there. It just does. Because even as I'm starting to use it, and as you mentioned it, like when you ask it to write a paper and analyze, you read that and you're able to sniff out, even if you just kind of sniff it out. All right, a lot of people say I can sniff out AI. It's one thing to kind of get a sense of it, but another thing to really be able to pinpoint it. And you're able to pinpoint it because you see the synthesis and the analysis to some degree is off. You got to have that base of knowledge in order to do that. And so the way I use AI, for example, is I use it like an assistant. It's almost like a grad assistant or whatever. It's like its level, or maybe not even that high. But I'm able to see like where it gets things wrong many times.
Yeah.
Probably not always, though, right? There's probably some things that just sneak right past. And so there's another real threat there. But you have to have some level of content expertise or competency to be able to use AI as a research assistant. So there's a challenge for undergrads. That's why they're there in the first place. So I don't know how you solve that problem. And you probably can't. So you shouldn't use it. How you police that, of course, is another thing. But then even from like the writing standpoint and the creative standpoint, I'll often use AI as like a brainstorming session. What are some possible titles here? If I were to do a talk on this, what are some cultural, current news kind of events that we can tie into a headline? It works for that. It also helps to think creatively about how to rephrase a sentence or a paragraph. But that's where this starts getting really tricky. Again, I'm 45. I've been writing for a long time. I've published 2 books. I have a lot of skill there. And so I can treat it like that. But if you start off like that, this becomes such a crutch. And again, going back to kind of a joking comment I said earlier, I don't know how a teenager can actually use AI right now versus AI using them. So I don't know what to do with all this, man. And I don't know if you've got any kind of even good guidelines, ways to think about this, because I'm concerned that I don't even know how to use it well, and I'm constantly going, am I using it appropriately? I see the risk to how it could undermine some of the skills that have gotten me to where I am. I do see it as a tool. It's a time saver. It's efficient. So I don't know, maybe before we move, kind of just turn the page on this into some other things. How are you using it? How are you using it? And kind of what's your take? What's your perspective there? What are some of the safety, guardrails that you have in place in your life with it?
Yeah. So I use it quite a bit. I probably use it every day in some way. I mean, whether I like it or not, it's in our phones, right? So when we're predictive texting, when it fills in the words, when I'm typing and it offers that. So we're all using AI every day in some way. We're talking about obviously the more large language models, the chat GPTs, the AI, all those sort of more complex models.
Now with X.
Yeah, exactly. So in those, for example, I'll give you, on my podcast stuff, a lot of my artwork, I'm using it to generate artwork, but I'll have a long process. Usually I have opened up 3 different artwork versions of different AIs, and I'll start typing in, give me this, and it doesn't do it the way I want it. I type in another one, I refine what I'm thinking. Eventually I get it to do what I want it to do. Sometimes I can do it in 5 minutes, sometimes I can do it in an hour. So I'm still processing that to get the image that I want the way I want it, and work around the restrictions that it has on that for what it'll generate for me. So I use that to generate a lot of artwork, which saves me time, because when I used to Photoshop, because I used to just do all my artwork, all my design stuff, but that would take so long that I don't have time to write and do the other things I want. So I am getting time back in my life. I use it for
real quick. What are you using for your images? Are you using Dolly? Are you using Grok? What do you use for that?
I use the Meta AI. I use I'll have to look it up here.
Oh, that's all right.
I can't remember off the top of my head. I use 3 different ones. I use Meta's, I use Google's, and I use another one that's a smaller one that I can't remember. But yeah, okay. I use the free versions. I'm too cheap to pay for stuff. So, those are what I use. The other thing I use it for are podcasts like this, where when I do live stuff with folks, I'll go on. So we're doing a series right now on different philosophical works. We just did one on, we're going to do one in a couple weeks on Descartes. And after we do this, I'm going to take that episode audio, I upload it into Substack, where I have all my stuff at. Substack uses AI to generate a transcript, right? That's what we're all seeing when we're seeing the transcripting stuff. For the most part, it's all AI. Then I take that AI generated transcript, I download it in text file, upload it into ChatGPT, and I say, ChatGPT, give me key summaries of ideas discussed in this episode. And it'll give me really good summaries for the most part. I say, okay, I want to do some discussion questions. So imagine I want to have a discussion question for knowledge retention for a college freshman. Give me 5 questions related to the topic of deism or whatever we're discussing. And it'll generate questions. And for the most part, those are pretty good. I'll have to do some soft editing. But to generate some of those summaries and questions would take me hours, right, to do it but I can do it in minutes with AI. And then I have stuff that I can post, and it's useful for people, but it still requires them to engage with the content to be able to answer or do those things. So that's why I use it a lot. I use it in meeting summaries. Same thing. It's built into what turned me on to that was actually a Zoom meeting once. And after the meeting, I didn't realize that I knew there was an AI turned on to generate a transcript, but it actually did a meeting summary, and it said, okay, here's the summary of the key points discussed in this meeting. Here were the tasks assigned to each person in the meeting. So Mike Sherrard, you're going to do X, Y, Z. Joe, you're going to do, A, B, C. And it actually was correct on this whole thing. I'm like, this is insanely amazing as far as, like you said, an assistant. So in those ways, saving time can be great.
When I'm using AI, I feel like Tony Stark. It's like I'm telling it to do things. I'm treating it like an assistant, and it increases productivity, and it is a time saver. And so I think maybe a final word on this from my vantage point would be that AI is tech. So it's amoral. It's not good or bad. It's all in terms of how one uses it. With some new tech, I think you need to create fence posts that are very small to begin with. And those initial fence posts are probably just, do I know what this is? So playing around with it, understanding its limitations and getting a sense of what it does, that's kind of like the first small yard you're going to play in. And so for especially probably parents that are listening to this because their kids are all on it, you need to become familiar with it. And the best way to become familiar with it is trying it out yourself. Before you integrate it into your life, just play with it. Just know what it is and know what it can do. And then slowly expand, I think, that fence, that yard that you're playing in, always with a critical eye and a discerning mind. asking questions like the ones we're asking today. What's too far? What's the cost? What do you gain? What do you lose? How do you implement this into a school setting like yours? I don't know that you can and you should. I mean, this has to be the conversation that we're a part of, because this thing's not going away. It has good usage. It's a clear threat, though. And we need more we need more people thinking about this than not. And so for any, Christian parents that are like, AI is the devil, maybe they're not that, that's not their posture, but they're like, I ain't touching it. No, you need to touch it, because we need good minds thinking about the way that we're to integrate this properly into our lives, because it is certainly not going away. So when it comes to critical thinking, and obviously AI has a role to play there, I wanted to talk to you about the state of biblical knowledge and the younger generations. We talked about university and kids going off there to be indoctrinated. Well, mom and dad spend 18 years raising their son or daughter in the ways of Jesus, send them off to a secular university, and it's seemingly all undone. Well, and part of the reason we're seeing that is we're sending them off to university without any actual real knowledge of a biblical worldview. The stat that everybody quotes right now is from Barna, and I think Impact 360 and Barna did a joint study on this, and the latest numbers are that Gen Z has 4% of Gen Z has a biblical worldview.
Yeah.
Just crazy small. I mean, it keeps shrinking. Any thoughts that this is a Christian nation? Now, it's an interesting conversation. Is this a Christian nation? Probably so, because it's impossible to underestimate. Wait. You can't underestimate the degree to which the Christian worldview has infected everything. Infect is probably a wrong word there when I'm talking about this in a good way. How it has informed and built so much here in this country, and even from an ethical perspective. I'm reminiscent of Nietzsche, how he would be criticizing the English atheists, going, "Yeah, you think you moved on from God, you don't even know the half of it. The air you live and breathe is the Christian air." And so to that degree, yeah, America's still probably a Christian nation because of that. In terms of practice, behavior, and the knowledge of God, well, yeah, okay, 4% of us have a biblical worldview. So what's going on there? And that's kind of a really broad question. It's kind of like, how did we end up here? What's the way forward? How do we address this? And even like, if you want to unpack this, worldview is a word thrown around a lot. What is a worldview, and kind of what are the essentials of a biblical worldview?
Yeah.
I know I just gave you 17 questions there. Sorry.
I'll answer all 18 of the 17 questions you asked. So just on the short side, for anybody not familiar, worldview, the way I define it, it's the lens we use to interpret the world and make sense of all of our life meanings, to try to answer these basic questions of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. And those four categories of questions really cover the spectrum from where did I come from, how did I get here, to what happens when I die, what's my future hold, kind of thing. How should I act in life? What's the right thing to do in any given situation? Should I vote for this person or that person? Which policy is the right policy? Worldview is that lens that's going to say, okay, here's how I'm going to pull all of those things together and give a straightforward, simple answer to that. And so even our students that may be in churches where they've listened to Sunday sermons and they know information about the Bible, and it's true information. Jesus is fully God and fully man, or truly God, truly man is a better way to say it. He was born in Bethlehem, or they know whatever they know, they gathered together. What they don't necessarily know is how to use all of that to shape the way they're now going to interpret the confrontations they get in their life. Right? How am I going to interpret this thing that I experience when I go to college? And so the challenge is, and this gets to a hint on parenting side of this, for this worldview side, is that the way we've structured church doesn't allow our young people to generate a Christian biblical worldview, even if they have a good theology.
All the facts right. Yeah, right, that's a great point. Sorry,
and
go on.
So Yeah, no, and think about it this way. We have age segregated gatherings. And I know years ago we talked about this when you were still pastoring and we were doing our PhD stuff together. We have these age segregated way of approaching, right? The demographics. Oh, here's our youth and here's our adults. But think about this, parents. If your child goes to a great youth group, oh, great, and they have great teaching, whatever, but they've never seen you struggle with, okay, we can't pay the rent, or this bill, we lost this job, or my mom is dying, but we try to hide the struggle with, God, why did you allow this to happen with me, right? Those are the questions that we're asking. God, this isn't fair. Why did this happen? Those are the pain point questions we experience, but they never see you struggle. Or our churches never speak about the cultural issues of LGBTQIA plus, or critical theories or race or racism and those issues, because that's not in the text. So we don't preach about it. And that's the argument given, which is a bad argument, but that's the argument given. But then they go to school and now all of a sudden they're struggling for the first time in life. Now all of a sudden they're suffering in a way they hadn't before. They're confronted with ideas they've never been confronted with before. But they think that their theology has no connection to their reality, the day-to-day life that they live, because they don't have a worldview framework to allow them to transfer, to synthesize, like we talked about earlier with AI, right? They can't synthesize, if I have this doctrine of humanity, how does that relate to whether I should cheat or not, or whether I should, sleep with this person or not? I know it's wrong, but
change my gender, right? Yeah, right.
Change my gender, right? Now they go home and they're being indoctrinated in certain things or just being confronted with life, and the mom and dad are confronted with their kid who's changing, and they say, "Well, but little Timmy, don't you remember we taught you this?
We taught you."
Yeah. What do they say?
And sorry, man, I'm cutting in here, man. That's a huge piece of it. Even if our kids have a bunch of facts, they don't know how to synthesize these facts with the world that they're encountering. And a big reason why that is because of the environment of our churches. They're all now know this environments. Now know this.
Yeah.
Now know this. Know this.
Exactly. And that then, think about the other things students say then. They say, Mom and Dad, you don't know, you don't understand. You don't get my world, my experience. You don't know what I'm facing. So they assume that they have maybe some sort of shared knowledge about God, but not shared knowledge about the world in which we live. And so they say, your knowledge that you taught me about God doesn't answer the questions I'm facing. Therefore, something is defective in your knowledge. Well, it's not the knowledge of God that's wrong. It's the inability to shape it through a worldview framework to apply that knowledge to diverse, changing cultural circumstances. So yes, it's a knowledge-based culture that doesn't teach that knowledge how to process that and use it in a different context. And that's what we're not teaching them. And that directly relates to our AI issue we talked about, the indoctrination issues, the issues of what education should be. All of those issues are really the same thing coming up here again. How do we think? How do we process information? Can I think reasonably about these things and put it together? And that's what worldview gives us a framework to do it. So young people believe Christianity is a faith, but they don't see that it is also a worldview that helps them answer those questions of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny.
So it seems it's pretty clear to me how just the intergenerational way we segregate churches does not help things. And even assuming the best case scenario where children get all the facts, they're learning facts amongst peers that don't know what to do with these facts. They need to be immersed in the life of the church where they're seeing these facts in action, if you will. And
exactly. That orthodoxy must lead to orthopraxy, right?
And they have to see it, and not just within your own family, but amongst a community. And that just doesn't happen. That just does not happen. I want to say anywhere, which I know is literally not true, but it seems like that.
Feels that way.
We've adopted this attractional model to church. It's event driven. And it's, again, one now know this environment after another. You come and sit and you're really a passive participant. You're given a bunch of facts and you're told what to do with them in some settings. And again, to varying degrees, it's good teaching or bad teaching, but either way, it's still an environment of now know this. But that's not the way Jesus made disciples. It was a part of it. And I almost want to say a small part, the large gathering teaching, but his disciples walked with him. They saw how he interacted with his enemies. I mean, you can imagine hearing a good talk on how to have respectful and witty and clever, conversations with your opponents. And you're like, oh, I'm going to write that bullet point down. Oh, that's really good. Oh, that's really good too. Oh yeah. Okay. Don't assume the burden of proof. Okay. That's really good. Yeah. It's quite another thing to see Jesus, right? Mm-hmm. Calling the Pharisees the sons of Satan, and just that whole back and forth. And I'm sure there was so much more that they saw. Of course, there's more. John told us there's a lot more that Jesus did that is not even in this. So you think about that element of discipleship, of walking so closely to somebody, as a rabbinic saying says, is you walk so closely to your rabbi that you're covered in the dust of their sandals. And you think about what Jesus's disciples had. They didn't just have the facts and this propositional knowledge of God. They saw Jesus in action. They gleaned wisdom from this and how to apply this. And that mostly is just absent from church.
It's also absent from the way we do our church, but even our apologetic adventures that we go on, and our programs and the way we approach the whole concept. We value, just like in church, we value programs. In the culturally, we value the sage on the stage. The wise person will teach us all the arguments. But it goes back to
which is what we're doing right now.
Yeah, exactly. Well, no, but hopefully we're encouraging people to think beyond that, though. There's a difference between conveying the information and teaching people how to process, and a sort of like in my engineering thing, derive the equation, right? Here's the basic truths about God. Now, you have to derive that. Now you're given a context. How do you take the knowledge you have and how do you shape that to answer properly the question you're being confronted with? So I teach, I've always approached more as an incarnational apologetics. I don't think we define our apologetics well. And I have a whole episode, 2 episodes I actually did early on when I started my new podcast version here, Raise the Roof, on that. One was called Incarnational Apologetics, and the other one was called Unreasonable Faith, intentionally emphasizing the irrationality of faith. Because here's the thing. If you look at Paul when he uses that word apologia, and this does relate to the education model too, by the way. So I know it's a little tangential, but I do think they're interconnected here. So when Paul uses that word, every time he uses it, he says, you've known this and you've seen it lived out amongst me, right? When he's confronting the false teachers, he says, hey, they're teaching you this thing. I taught you something else. But how did we live among you? Also, he's saying, look at the fruit of our ministry in the people, our disciples. Look at our disciples versus their disciples. So the apologia was always in a life context, because Paul was spending months, if not years, with certain groups of people. So every time he's reminding them of the truth of Christ, the argument for Christ, he's reminding them of the context of relationship in which that truth was conveyed. So when we look and think about how we do apologetics, and I think Summit, I'll throw in a plug here. I was going to mention them later about what parents could do, but I'll throw in a plug for them in the time that I got at least to visit there with you and see that is, there's people that talk, they get a chance to do Q&A, but there's somebody like yourself who's there for whole weeks at a time. You build relationships. It's the effort to teach the information, but in a relational context. And I think that's the critical thing with our churches, with parents, the way you raise your children. Don't just teach them about God. Teach them about God and the contextual relationship of life. Let them see you struggle. We always let our kids see us struggle. We had I got fired at certain times. I lost jobs. Bad stuff happened. We were losing, whatever. Our kids, when they were little, they prayed with us. And they saw me cry. And they saw me struggle with, I don't know how I'm going to pay this bill. I didn't hide any of that from my kids, because I want them to know when I'm struggling with these things, God is my answer. God is what gives me hope in the midst of this thing. So someday when they're struggling with something, they can't say to me, you don't know what I'm going through, because they do know I've gone through stuff, and they do know that God is truly the apologia. He is the answer. The relationship that we built is that the apologia that helps us survive. And so that's the framework we have to do it in churches. And I'm not saying it's bad to have this, wise speakers come out or do podcasts like this. I'm saying the way we need to live it out, though, is in the context of relationship, as Paul did.
Incarnational apologetics. That's a great phrase. Is there a book with that title?
I have not written it yet, but I have a podcast with the title. I had a guy wants me to publish a book on it, but I just can't get around to writing it.
Oh, that's a book that needs to be written. Relational apologetics and incarnational apologetics. Man, you can sell those two books together.
I know. I read your book. They actually complement each other because you don't go quite the direction I go with it, but I do think you touch on some of those key points in your book, and I think that there is definitely some crossover.
So. Yeah, there's some people that are doing this well. Summit does it well. Their big thing is truth and relationship. Brett Kunkel at Maven, just had dinner with Brett and Aaron, his wife, last night. My wife did. Nice treat. And one of the things they do with Maven is they do immersive experiences. So they'll do some training and then go out in the field and talk to people talk to Mormons, go to Berkeley, talk to secularists or whatever. And so there's that incarnational element to it. It's something our ministry, Apologetics Inc., is dedicated to, and trying to figure out the way to exist in a content creation space, knowing that content isn't the solution all by itself. In many ways, content by itself creates other problems. So how do you use content to invite people into a community? That's the key for us. And that's kind of the strategy behind what we do. And that's why we have something like 7x7 Conversations, which is a youth discipleship curriculum, but it's conversation based. It's not sage on the stage kind of format. It's learn through conversation. It's designed to be done, even in homes. So there's the element of hospitality, and there's this, I can see how you live. I can see how your house is messy one week and you didn't have time to clean up and you still had people come over. You can see how the adults in the room handle the younger kids that aren't a part of, you can see this. So there's that incarnational approach. And it's also why I kind of do this podcast like this. When I was, there's some of that pressure, when you're in apologetics ministry, or when's you going to do your podcast? When are you going to do podcast? I'm like, I don't know. What am I going to do? But then one day I was just sitting around thinking, you know what I would like to do? I would like to talk to my friends more. Why don't I just do that on a podcast? Why don't I just talk to my friends that, maybe there's a vocational friendship too, right? Like we're in the same kind of work, and just talk about what's interesting to me. And so the nature of this conversation, right? There's elements of, I don't know. How are you thinking about this? How are you doing this? I don't know. So it's kind of inviting this relational element, this incarnational element. And I think that's really important for Christians to think about in this, how do I want to put it? There's an overabundance of content out there, and content it's not really making things better by itself, and it just won't by itself. It has to be consumed in an environment where you're seeing other people live it out, right? And so anyhow, I think that is a big part of it. And I am seeing, pastors and churches kind of awaken to this idea, and they're trying to figure it out too. So maybe we're on a more positive trajectory here, but we've got to start creating environments that are discipling in nature, like in the way that we're talking about, in like the way that Jesus discipled. Christians cannot just keep producing content in one form after the other, or one event after the other, and think that's going to do anything. It's not. It's clearly not. It's just not working.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
So is there what's going on at GCU? How are you guys, engaging your students on this when it comes to a biblical worldview standpoint, and even some of the elements that we've talked about here, this incarnational element? How are you in your role at GCU and the school more broadly, maybe? How are you guys handling this?
So just to give a context for what we do here, Christian Worldview, when I came to teach here 2 years ago, I was brought on to teach Christian Worldview, and that's my entire job. So I teach this nonstop. So this fall, right now, I'll have 4 classes, roughly 300 students, and but collectively this year, GC will probably have about 20,000 students go through our Christian Worldview 101, whether online or on ground. So there's a broad commitment to worldview engagement. The reason I came here is because I get the chance to help develop the curriculum. So moving forward, I get the chance to shape what content and how we're doing it, the approaches, the assignments, and all those things. And I'm going to try to build in as many of these kinds of things as I can as time goes forward. So that's, generationally in terms of impact, I said, okay, well, maybe there's a great opportunity God's given me to impact potentially, a large number of students more than I could in any other context throughout the next bunch of years of my life. So there's a commitment to that from the president on down, which is phenomenal. We try to build worldview into every course. Matter of fact, it's required. Every professor in their class has to have certain assignments that engage from a Christian worldview perspective. Every degree offered here has to have a worldview engagement component. About, I think, 20% or something. So of every degree, or 25% of every degree, has to have a worldview content included in that. And then we use our College of Theology here to try to equip and the rest of our colleges who aren't not necessarily theologically trained or worldview savvy. We try to give them tools so that they can better do that in their class. So we're a work in progress. Some do it better than others, but the passion and the energy and the money has been put into it to make sure we're doing that for our students. And so, but the interesting part about GCU is the College of Theology, we're a covenant community, so we sign a statement of faith, and we're pretty solid statement of ethics, that sort of thing. But the student body is the university is missional. And I like this only for this reason. So GCU does a lot in the local community, puts millions of dollars into helping, do all kinds of stuff, phenomenal stuff, which is a whole other conversation. But we attract a lot of students here who are not believers. So in my class, I keep track every semester. My largest component is those who claim to be Christian. Probably about like 10% of those actually are, based on their answers to questions when they turn in papers. But the next biggest part are those who identify as nones, no religion at all, or I believe in God, but I don't want the label, right? That's nones. The next 2 big groups are actually agnostic and then atheist. Come after that, and then I'll get my share of, I've had Muslims, I've had Wiccans in my class, I've had Mormons, I've had all kinds of other people. But we have a very diverse classroom in that way. And I love teaching worldview in that context because I encourage my Christian students in there they went to Christian high school, they did all the stuff, they think they know all the answers, which I always tell them, that's always amazing because if they know everything about worldview and theology coming out of high school because they had a class, I really wasted a lot of my life doing a lot of education because I could have just gone to your high school and really saved a lot. But anyway, so... But they come in as sort of lacking humility to understand is even if you know everything, even if that's true, what you don't understand is that you're now in a room where you're going to have group assignments with people who don't think like you. How are you going to help them see the truth of Christ in the Christian worldview? Because you have a classroom where you can be the evangelist, you can be the bringer of good news, but they don't know how to do it. They don't know how to live out the truth that they have. So I try to create a classroom environment where they can do that. I've had pizza nights with students. They really engaged. We have good conversations in class, but they get a little too deep for a class of 100 or a class of 50 where you have to be careful, especially as you get into issues of gender and sex and certain things that you don't know how people perceive the words being said or the questions other students ask. So I'm able to pull them into smaller environments and buy them some pizza and, hey, let's dialogue about it. And we've seen some very good results with that. I teach them how to evaluate. So one of the big barriers is I'm teaching you Christian worldview. This is probably not your worldview, but this isn't a class of indoctrination. This is a class where you get to think beyond the internet memes and the tribalism of the world around, and we'll have disagreements and we can learn how to disagree, but you're going to learn how to question the Christian worldview. You're going to hear an actual good framing of it, and then we'll teach you tests, the 3 worldview tests to go in and test your worldview, test Christianity. I want you to test it, see if it's true. See if it's internally consistent and coherent. Does it correspond with the realities of the world around? Is it practical? Is it livable? But then do it for your own worldview. And nobody else can do that except you. And so the challenge I try to get them is through the assignments and through the work is to say, can you evaluate your worldview in the same way you just evaluated mine? That you've already come in saying, I reject it. But why do you reject it? Now that you know why you reject it, can you apply it to yours? And does that open your eyes up to see, well, maybe actually Christianity is more reasonable. Maybe it's more livable than I thought it was because I've learned how to think critically about my own worldview and that I even have one, and now evaluate a healthy version of the Christian worldview, not what I've seen caricatured in the media and on the internet. So those are some of the things that I'm doing within the classroom. I'll pause there. This could be more, but we'll go off that for now.
Yeah, well, it's real encouraging to hear about how you're thinking about this and how you're implementing it and the commitment that you said that GCU has. I've not been out there. I'm really interested to come out there sometime and see what's going on there, because I know the school's getting really, really big and a lot of opportunity to influence the next generation there. And so I'm glad for your work there. Yeah. Last idea here, maybe to end on just kind of a hope-filled note.
Yeah.
Moving forward in this cultural moment and the state of universities and just the indoctrination through the airwaves or whatnot, what kind of hope is there for parents out there who want to pass on a biblical faith? We've already talked about this kind of immersive quality to that. More than having a sage, they just need to see your faith in action. Is there anything else you want to comment there that might be a helpful tip for parents trying to navigate this, or a young man or woman who's about ready to head off to college, right, and is understanding the challenges that they face? What have you got for us there?
I'll say that prior to coming, when I was living in California, I lived there for 12 years in San Diego before I came here. And it's a big change to go from San Diego to Phoenix, Arizona. Weather's a little bit different. My wife had to be pried away from the beach,
I bet.
So it was not easy. But I'll admit, Mike, that I had given up hope in the culture, in our next generation, and I was pretty hopeless, especially living in the context of California and where I'd seen just the whole framework. Coming here almost instantly, not just to GCU, but even just out of California, I started to see that there's hope in the world. I started to see, when I started to meet and talk to my students, I've become very hopeful. When I started to talk to the faculty we have here in our College of Theology and get to know them, I was always waiting for the next shoe to drop in terms of, okay, it looks good on paper, but where have we really compromised to the culture? And I've seen nothing but positive so far, from the president on down through our college, just a strong devotion to, we have to remain firm and true to the truth of Christ in the midst of the cultural chaos. And there's been a doubling down and a reaffirmation of the trust in God's word and the scripture and the person of Christ is our only hope of salvation. So in a university that's 25,000 on ground, about 100,000 online, you think, oh, the only way you grow is through compromise. But it's actually been the opposite. I've seen a faithfulness here that's been encouraging to me. So I just want to say that there isn't a loss of hope. I would say that parents, when you're thinking about your kids, first, we've got to be aware of the kinds of questions they're asking, and I think this doesn't come out well in a lot of the apologetic works that are popular. Even a lot of the groups that I'm involved with, the Fellow Reasons to Believe, which is science and faith type issues. So I deal with those sort of issues, but that doesn't turn the crank of almost any of my students. They just don't really care. They're not interested in the evidence for the cosmos had a beginning and all this other sort of stuff. Now, I'm not saying it's not relevant. That's a separate piece. I'm saying that's not their entry point into the dialogue. That's what I'm trying to get across. So even the Christians in my classroom are moral relativists. Even the strong ones that have gone to tend to be moral relativists. Their first question they're asking isn't, is God real or is Christianity true? They're asking, is God good? Is Christianity good? And until we can answer and show them that and give them not just arguments like the moral argument, that's what I'm just actually showing them in our lifestyle that Christianity is a moral good, that God is a good God. And there's no way to do that except through the incarnational life of living with your parenting them, letting them see the things like we talked about. So that's the entry point for all of your kids. Culturally speaking, it's what's on their for all that they're seeing around them. So that's going to be the place to jump in at. But when my first son was born, 24 years ago now, I wasn't even worried about how to be a dad or a father because I'd thought so much about that. When I held him in my arms, actually the first question, Mike, that came to my mind is, how do I make him a disciple? How do I make my son a disciple of Jesus? I'd been disciple making at that point since, for a long time. And I knew about when people are fully formed, but I didn't know what I was supposed to do with my kid. So I say that because parents, it's be a mom, be a dad, but also be a disciple maker. And it starts when they're young. It starts with, again, letting them join in on life, doing life with you, and to be a role model. Paul talked about that, right? So parents, get educated yourself. Colson Fellows has a great worldview. It's like a 10-month thing. It sounds scary, intimidating. Do it. Other groups have educational programs for adults. So don't just push them to God or to church. The only way people come is when you're calling them towards something, right? You have to be where you're calling them towards. You can't say, run over there, it's safe. You have to say, come over here, it's safe. Come over here is where God will meet you. And they need to see that you're there, right? So that's the thing. Educate yourself, understand that worldview stuff. Join in with podcasts or do whatever you can do on your commute, those sorts of things. Create positive learning opportunities for your kids. We talked about Summit Ministries. Their summer school is an immersive way to get that involved. So create learning opportunities where they can also have things modeled. To be honest, and I won't be as dramatic as all college is a scam here, but when I say get your kids out of public school, with the caveat, it may depend on where you're at. Right. So
that's right. Yeah.
We did keep our kids in public school. We were in San Diego. Our particular community was solid. I had some pushback occasionally, and I went in and talked to the principal, and he's like, you're right. And this was a guy who was a gay guy who was not a Christian. And there was a professor, there was actually a Christian professor showing a Dawkins video in the science class, but didn't understand who Dawkins was. And I said, I don't mind you teaching my kid things that I might not agree with, but you can't teach them through somebody who says Christians are evil, horrible people. That's biasing my children against my life, not just teaching them science. And this gay guy principal who wasn't a Christian said, you're right. This is not good. We'll never use those videos here. So most people, there's a lot of good, reasonable people that don't share my worldview, that don't share my lifestyle, that are not Christians, that are still potentially good educators. Take the time, get to know what's happening in your context. If you are in a conservative state, doesn't mean your school is a good school. If you are in a progressive liberal state, doesn't mean your school is a bad school. Be thoughtful, be engaged. The easy answer is, it's all a scam, get them out, everything's evil. That's the easy, thoughtless answer. The thoughtful answer is, get involved, be connected. But in a lot of cases, you're going to have to find a new high school. And then the last thing I'll say on this is teaching them humility. As I kind of alluded to earlier, the students that I've had students that came in as pastors' kids that have had Christian education and they've had worldview classes, and they're keen to tell me that on day one because they feel like they know all the answers. And last semester, and I tell them all, look, you're not going to pass. That's not going to work. This is not how life is. And so last semester, I have the student come to me and he's failing the class. I got to go tell my dad, who's a pastor, that I'm failing Christian worldview. And I said, I told you that on day one. He's like, yeah, you told me, you warned me. And, but I thought I knew enough to get away and just show up for the quiz or write the paper. And I said, this is the problem. You and I, it's like, we laugh about, you teach my degrees and know all these things. I just love to learn, and I didn't pursue the degrees. I was pursuing learning. And students that don't get that, here's what they'll tell me at the end of my course summaries. They give this thing. They'll say, I didn't learn anything in this class. And I always laugh because had they been in the class, they'd know that that's actually a criticism of you, not of me. Because I don't learn you anything. I teach, only you can learn, right? You get out of everything what you invest into it, right? College is only a scam if you treat it like a party school and, go through and just a degree mill. But you can go in any environment. You can learn in any school if you put your mind to learning, right? And so learning is only something the individual can do. You can't be learned, you can be taught, but you can't be learned. Learning is an active thing that you participate in. And it takes humility to say, I don't know, I don't understand, I want to get something out of this. And if you do that, parents, you can teach that and you can model it, your kids will be successful in life.
Well, I think that's a nice place to end, Joe. Nice work. That's really good stuff. And for those that want to learn, that's one of the big reasons why Apologetics Inc. exists. The ministry that I work for is to provide helpful resources that show why Christianity is true and satisfying. So what we talked about there, Joe, right? There's two sides of this really important coin of, is it good? Is it true? The next generation right now is more concerned with, is it good than it is it true? But they're both very important to understand. And anyways, that's why we exist. It's to help equip you to know why it is true and satisfying and how to share that news creatively and clearly. And one thing real quick for those of you that have made it to the end, simple things like the traditional subscribing really helps. But I also want you to know that right now our ministry is doing a matching grant campaign. And if you've benefited from content like this and you want to see this content go and reach more people and our speaking team go and reach more people, every dollar you give right now will be doubled and matched. And so your impact is doubled. And you can go to apologetics.org/donate to find out how you can get involved. Joe, thanks for indulging that last little plug there, man. You do great work. I wish we lived closer. Hopefully I can get a chance to get out there to Arizona and see you before long, my friend. All right, till then.
God bless.